Jerry, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. And I would like to just tell Jerry and Interguard that you are actually a real friend to us as well. We have a long, constant partnership at the Department of Homeland Security, especially within the Office of Infrastructure Protection, with Interguard. And over the course of the year, engage in a number of joint activities around planning, around sharing tools and information, but most importantly, in some ways, out in the field, working across the 16 sectors in the name of advancing physical and cybersecurity protection, ensuring that we are working closely together to help owners and operators and industry understand the very dynamic risk environment that we're in. So thank you. I think over the course of the next 12 months, you'll see even more exciting things happen between our two organizations. I am delighted to be here to talk to you about our efforts on the space weather front. I know that my colleague, Director Fugate, or Administrator Fugate, was here earlier giving his perspectives on the space weather strategy and action plan, and I'm going to focus more on the prevention and mitigation side and the work that we have done around that. I will tell you that this has really been a very rewarding subject for me to work on. And when I think back 3 years ago, when I stepped into this role and what I thought encompassed the range of threats and hazards that could impact critical infrastructure, space weather was not necessarily one of those, but in part because of my good friend Bill Murtaugh, and certainly the advocacy of many of you in this room. I learned a lot both about this hazard, but about the ways that it can impact critical infrastructure. And this is, I think, really exemplary of how we approach the whole all hazards landscape when we think about critical infrastructure security and resilience. We recognize that there are a range of threats and hazards that are out there. Some are higher probability, lower consequence. Some are lower probability, higher consequence. And it's really important for us to work with owners and operators to understand this risk landscape, recognizing that we can't protect against everything, but how do we look at the consequences and build a program that really mitigates the range of these consequences most effectively. And that's, at the end of the day, what we do in the Office of Infrastructure Protection. To that end, it has been an honor for the department and certainly for me to serve as the co-chair of the National Space Weather Strategy effort alongside my colleagues in the White House, Bill in particular, but certainly across the interagency and with the National Weather Service. In addressing space weather at a national strategic level, the focus of my office has been understanding the potentially devastating impacts of this hazard within the context of all hazard critical infrastructure security and resilience. I think one of the most important things that we've done is ensuring that the process of developing this national strategy was collaborative across whole of community. And that really does include owners and operators, and making sure that the private sector, those who own and operate our nation's infrastructure, had a voice, had input into this strategy. Because at the end of the day, the security and resilience of our nation's infrastructure is not primarily a governmental responsibility, but rather it requires a national partnership. And to that end, I do want to thank my private sector colleagues, both for their enduring efforts to ensure the security and resilience of our infrastructure, but certainly for their partnership on this front. The other interesting thing about the work that we've done on space weather is the recognition that this is a global hazard. And in general, I think when you think about the security and resilience of infrastructure, we know really at the end of the day that it has no boundaries. It's not limited by geographic boundaries because of the nature of these systems and networks. But certainly when you look at the hazard of space weather, it is a global hazard, and so it has enabled us to really think about how we are coordinating internationally on this effort. So we've worked to integrate an improved understanding of the impacts of space weather, of geomagnetic phenomenon, into how we do our business, into the sector coordination structure that we have established under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan and the National Preparedness System. And that's really what I want to focus on, is how preparing for space weather events requires joint action from the public and private stakeholders, really bringing our shared expertise and responsibilities that are embedded in our infrastructure goals. And the preparation, the work is really focused on reducing vulnerability, minimizing our risks, addressing the potential cascading impacts, and at the end of the day, enhancing resilience to this particular hazard. So I hope all of you have had an opportunity to look at the space weather strategy. I think it's been 2 months, Bill, since we about rolled it out, but there are 6 overall goals which are structured to be mutually supportive. The first one is establishing benchmarks for space weather events. The second is enhancing response and recovery capabilities. The third goal is improving protection and mitigation efforts to space weather. The fourth is improving assessment, modeling, and prediction of impacts on critical infrastructure. The fifth is improving space weather through advanced understanding and forecasting. And then the sixth, and I touched a little bit on this, is how we increase international collaboration on this front. My office, the Office of Infrastructure Protection, is really focused on the third goal, which is improving mitigation and protection. And at the end of the day, risks like space weather, but also cyber attacks, EMP, illustrate the highly interdependent nature of critical infrastructure and demonstrate why we need to take the time to plan to make investments in the protection and mitigation across different hazards that will have co-benefits. So goal 3, which again is improving protection and mitigation efforts, was written in the context of the strategic imperatives that align under Presidential Policy Directive 21, which is critical infrastructure security and resilience, and really focuses on the whole of community efforts to protect our nation's critical infrastructure, and then Presidential Policy Directive 8, which focuses on national preparedness. PPD8 and the National Preparedness System already contain a robust architecture for national protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And then out of PPD 21 comes the National Infrastructure Protection Plan and the way that we work with sectors, both to address these threats and hazards specific to their own sectors, but think about them from a cross-sector perspective as well, and offer us a framework for how we deal with some of these high-profile risks, such as space weather. In addition to the oversight and input from the entire interagency Space Weather Task Force, we had a number of active participants in the development of the strategy and the action plan. That included the Department of Energy, FEMA, again, who you heard from earlier, the Department of Defense, FAA, and DHS's own Science and Technology Directorate. So let's turn now specifically to the core elements of Goal 3, and there are several. And again, I'm going to keep foot stomping this, but at the end of the day, the way that we've articulated and laid out this goal is the recognition that the federal government doesn't own and operate most of the nation's critical infrastructure, and that really at the end of the day, if we are going to effectively prevent, or I shouldn't say prevent, but mitigate the impacts of this hazard, we have to work in close partnership with owners and operators of critical infrastructure. So to that end, the first element is how do we look at the relevant legal mechanisms, authorities, and incentives that can be used to protect our critical infrastructure and the systems and networks associated with them. So we know already that a number of statutory and regulatory authorities are already in place to protect critical infrastructure, and that there are also incentives that encourage actions by owners and operators. And so part of this is continuing to look at what is in place, but identifying authorities, gaps, and issues related to these mechanisms. I think part of what is unique about what we do in the Office of Infrastructure Protection is at the end of the day, most of our work is in support of owners and operators, and 95% of it is all voluntary. How do we encourage owners and operators, really given the dynamic environment they're living in, to adopt a risk management approach and to ensure that they are as secure and resilient as they can be? But we are learning over time that given, again, this complex environment that we're living in, faced by all of these threats and hazards, that this can become an expensive proposition. And so really, how do we think about how to incentivize owners and operators to make those needed investments, and how can we encourage them to adopt leading practices to address gaps where they may not have thought about a particular hazard. And so that's really what the first element is focused on. The second, in some ways, is the most important thing that we do within the Department of Homeland Security, working across the interagency and with owners and operators, but is to develop the plan, right? You got to start somewhere. You need a plan to address the range of threats and hazards that we're dealing with. And so that will be one of the main thrusts of what we work on, is how do we develop hazard mitigation plans that help owners and operators reduce vulnerabilities, manage the risks, and at the end of the day, if needed, assist with response to the impacts associated with space weather. And again, this is where this whole of community approach comes into place, and it is both looking at how we share information, how do we improve the mechanisms by which we're doing that, including leveraging information sharing and analysis organizations, but thinking about innovative approaches to ensure our partners have the information that they need. It is also incumbent on us, I think, to come together once you have a plan, knowing that no plan survives contact, but really to test and exercise those plans, and then to take the after action that comes out of those exercises and use it to improve the plans and the things that we are working towards. I think a critical part of this, and this is certainly where we are often, most challenged, and where you in this room come into play, but how do we achieve long-term vulnerability reduction to space weather events? By implementing appropriate measures at critical locations that are most susceptible to space weather. And I know from going out around this country, and in particular working with some of our partners in the electricity sector, there is investment around this country going on to ensure that we can mitigate some of these vulnerabilities. But really, frankly, more needs to be done. And I think continuing to look for innovative solutions, standards, best practices, operational procedures that will improve the protection and resilience is vital to this whole of community effort. It is important to point out that the space weather benchmark events described in the first strategic goal, which again is established benchmarks for space weather events, are going to be used and leveraged to support the adoption of design standards for enhanced resilience, to evaluate strategies for and the priorities for and feasibility of protecting those critical assets, and fostering the mechanisms for sharing best practices that promote the mitigation of and damage from of systems and networks impacted by space weather. Another core element of this, and again, we've been at this for 10 years, but the range of threats and hazards that we focus on from the public-private partnership has evolved. And so how do we continue to build this public-private partnership to support private action to reduce overall public vulnerability to space weather, given, again, this very kind of complex all hazards environment that we are living in right now. And so, at the end of the day, it's how we work with those private sector entities to ensure their resilience to this range of events, including space weather. So, one of the efforts that, again, I think is critical to those of you sitting in this room is how do we incorporate resilience measures into the systems that span infrastructure in this country, and continue to look for mechanisms that we can share information, and as I mentioned earlier, identifying incentives and disincentives for investing in resilience measures, and really help make the business case for making these investments on the front end, as opposed to getting to a place where we're in a response and recovery phase, and the resources that need to be applied to respond are, at the end of the day, probably more than had we made those investments in the front end. I think at the end of the day, when you think about what are the critical considerations for success, the risks posed by space weather highlight the independent nature or the interdependent nature of our critical infrastructure systems, and demonstrate how investments in protection and mitigation across multiple hazards can have co-benefits. And again, this is whether we're talking about space weather, we're talking about cybersecurity, whether we're talking about EMP, and this is frankly our biggest challenge. I stand up here as the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection, and as much as we're focused on weather, whether here on ground or up in space, we're also very worried about a asymmetric threat, about a very changing counterterrorism environment, and it's when you're sitting there as an owner and operator trying to figure out where to apply resources given this very complex environment, it can be challenging. And so how do you make sure a potential hazard like space weather is considered given the range of other things that a company is looking at? I do just want to speak a little bit to grid resilience. It is something that has been in the news an awful lot lately. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and it applies in the context of whether we're talking about space weather, about cyber, about hurricanes, you name it. I think at the end of the day, we all know that we cannot protect every asset, network and system from every threat and every hazard. And there is certainly a lot of room for improvement when it comes to thinking about how we secure our nation's electric grid, how we ensure it is more resilient. But I will tell you, more resilient. But I will tell you, at the end of the day, I think the grid is an incredibly resilient system, a very resilient infrastructure. We have worked over the course of the last 12 years, both in a regulatory framework, but equally important in a voluntary framework, to support the efforts of owners and operators to ensure that we have a resilient grid. And I think we're buoyed by the fact that at the end of the day, we've created this very complex system, and in itself, it makes the grid very resilient. Our former NSA and CIA Director Michael Hayden has said that because of the biodiversity of the grid, it is inherently resilient. And so then you layer on top of that the work that we have done around focusing on kind of a defense in depth approach to how you secure the grid, and that's deterrence, detection, prevention, and prioritization. And I think at the end of the day, it is important that we continue to think about how we evolve the resilience of the grid, but I think that we are overall, can be assured that the grid is a pretty resilient system. We continue, as we look at how we modernize it, to make sure that we are doing what we can as a federal government in support of owners and operators to maintain the security and the resilience of the grid. It involves kind of rethinking the partnership that we have with owners and operators. So as much as we're communicating on a daily basis with directors of security, with chief security officers, with chief information security officers about, again, the range of threats across cyber and physical, we have also recognized that bringing chief executive officers and others from the C-suite to the table to focus on this issue is very important, because at the end of the day, they are managing enterprise risk. They're concerned about regulatory risk, operational risk, brand risk, and they need to be focused on security and resilience. And I will tell you, at the end of the day, this is paying off. It has enormous dividends. Over the course of the last 3 years, we've been meeting, the federal government, on a regular basis with the CEOs of investor-owns, of the rural cooperatives, of the public power associations, to talk about these incidents of national significance, again, whether driven by our adversaries or by some sort of weather event, and how we ensure we understand what the roles and responsibilities are of government, of industry, and where we have some gaps. And it's led to really some productive efforts and deliverables, ranging from a playbook for how we're going to respond to a national incident to really a renewed look at our national transformer strategy. And so again, bringing those executives to the table who have more of a strategic view has proven very beneficial. We continue to think about how we can continue to share information with our owners and operators, both at the security level but also at the C-suite, and I think really have evolved both in terms of the sharing of classified information, but on the cyber side, doing this in a more machine speed fashion, where that sharing of information around vulnerabilities, cyber threats is relatively instantaneous. And we're evolving to a point where we can share indicators on a real-time basis and do it bidirectionally. So I think that is critical. And then again, how do we think about some of these strategic issues? I've talked a little bit about the National Transformer Strategy, but I will tell you that EMP, that space weather is also on the agenda as we think about what are these lower frequency but higher impact events and the need for industry and government to come together. I want to end, and I do want to leave some time for questions and try and keep you all on schedule. But by foot stomping and putting an exclamation point on the fact that we have to think about all of these threats and hazards from a risk management standpoint, and I think you've heard that theme run through my speech today. We can't prevent, we can't protect against every threat and hazard. And so it requires us to look at this from a risk management standpoint. I continue to make the argument that I think that this country has gotten better at responding to those higher probability, what I'm now calling kind of medium consequence events, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a tornado. We really have the ability to quickly, and it's part of the resilient nature of this country, but the fact that owners and operators, I think, do a very good job learning from the last event and improving it so they're in a better place at the next event. And if you look at kind of what's come out of Hurricane Sandy, even just within the electric sector and how they've rethought their mutual aid agreements, how they've rethought how they're going to need to respond to another Superstorm Sandy and all of the compacts that they have in place, it really is, I think, a sign of the resilient nature of that particular sector. But where we're at right now is I think we've got to pause and look at these lower frequency, high impact events and think about, again, how we mitigate the range of consequences that are caused by several of what I would call these lower frequency events. So that's our goal. Is to work with owners and operators to think about this from a risk management perspective, to make the case that investing upfront, whether it's actually the preventative measures that you put in place, your strategies for planning, testing, and exercise, all of these investments on the front end are going to save you dollars on the back end. The other piece of this, and this is certainly something that I think is important as we think about, and there's been a lot of conversation about infrastructure in the last few weeks, and you're starting to see it talked more about on the campaign trail, but as we begin to reinvest and we begin to modernize our nation's infrastructure, ensuring that we are baking in security and resilience up front is critical here. And that is something that we have started within the Office of Infrastructure Protection. We've got a infrastructure design and recovery effort that we have stood up that is really aimed at this. As we begin the design and build phase for new infrastructures, ensuring that we understand what the world today looks like, but what the world 100 years from now is going to look like. And how do we put in place security and resilience measures that are both attuned to today but to 100 years from now, and allow us through the operations and maintenance phase to make adjustments as needed. I think the last piece that I will leave you with in thinking about this, and I've talked a lot about the electricity subsector, but the need really to focus on the interconnections, the interdependencies. And I spent a lot of time going from sector to sector meeting, and the electricity sector will maintain they're the most important, the water sector will maintain they're most important, and the comm sector will maintain that they're the most important. But at the end of the day, all of these things intersect. They're interconnected, they're interdependent. A major disruption in one is going to have significant consequences in these other lifeline and strategic infrastructures. And we have to continue to work together to look at these intersections and to think about, in the event of a really bad day here, what are we doing to make sure that we can get all of those sectors to bounce back quickly? And that includes understanding how to prioritize it, how to make trade-offs, and ensuring that really the folks within government, at Craig's level, at my secretary's level, at the president's level, understand those priorities as well. So I will end by just saying this has been an incredibly gratifying project for me to work on, both because of the friendship that I have developed with Bill, who you are going to hear from next, because of the opportunity to work across multiple organizations who are thinking about this, but again, because I think at the end of the day we've taken a hazard that maybe in the past we would have just looked at through the federal government's eyes, and we've made sure that we've brought industry, the owners and operators, to the table, really to help drive those other core goals. So I think we're off to a good start. We've got a long way to go, but we've got a great strategy that will help guide us. So with that, I'm a few minutes over 1:30. Jerry, what, you want me to take a question or two? Question or two? Microphone? Yeah, absolutely.
Hi. Hello? Yeah. Am I? Okay. Hello, Tom Popick, Foundation for Resilient Societies. First of all, thank you very much for your engagement on these very important issues, and also for being willing to come and be a speaker at this event. Mm-hmm. We really do appreciate that. And as you can imagine, we listen very, very carefully to what you have to say. And one of the things, one of the points you made was that 90% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. That leaves still 10% that is owned by government entities. There are two very large transmission systems here in the United States, mm-hmm. Bonneville Power yep. and TVA, that are yep. our government-owned. One of the issues that we see is a reluctance among industry to be the first in installing certain protective measures, such as blocking devices. And I just wonder, is there any opportunity for these large federally owned entities to be platforms for proof of concept for some of these protective technologies?
So the short answer to that is yes. I've actually been out to Bonneville, which experienced a substation attack some years ago, and they're doing proof of concept around substation security. And so, absolutely. But I will tell you, I've also, on the other side of that, been to investor-owns in, this region that are doing proof of concept work as well. And not only are they doing it, but they're very willing to share the lessons learned and the best practices with the rest of industry.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Very good.
Gary, go on. Our chairman would like to make a presentation to you on behalf of the whole of community that you have called upon to respond to this. A number of them have pulled together top resources in government and industry to come up with a triple threat power grid exercise, which looks at a 1, 3, or 12-month-long nationwide disruption of power, either due to space weather, EMP, or cyber. And we would be glad to share this not only with DHS, but all the affiliated organizations that you work with, and actually can offer to be taught and collaborate with you and FEMA and others to make this an ongoing and continually improved product. So thank you very much.
Very good.
And maybe you might want to say a word because you know her. And and hogging the mic. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
Chuck, thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you,
very much.
absolutely.
Yes, I want to thank Caitlin for coming over and sharing with us her perspective and expertise and interest. And she has been a true supporter as we've gone forward in this effort. And I think that the alliances that we're building are going to further enable us to see the results of all your hard work and better protect this nation against those type of catastrophes.
Thank you very much, Gary. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.